So now we'll begin with our second issue, which is Legislative Referendum 126. As you know, this would end same-day voter registration. It will be on the ballot this November, as I understand it, so it's important that we know what we're voting for or voting against. And we have now two speakers. We have first John Ellingson, who is a former Montana State Senate Majority Leader, the former legal director of Montana ACLU, and has just finished, I think, a course which many of you may have attended on campaign finance reform in the Molly program at the university, which if you don't know anything about, I can only plug. It's a great program. So would you just give us a little bit of information about 126? You were there at the beginning of same-day voter registration, and let us know what's happening.
Yes, I was. I was proud to be the principal sponsor of the legislation that established same-day voter registration in 2005. My colleague Diane Sands was my principal staff person, and we worked long and hard during that legislative session to get this passed. At the time, lots of us thought that this was a great way to make sure that more voices were heard in our democratic system. And it is the bedrock of our democracy that everyone should be able to vote and cast his or her vote to influence the public policy matters of the day. And lo and behold, an awful lot of Republicans thought that that was a great idea back then as well. The bill passed with a vote of 89-8 in the House of Representatives. That was an overwhelming vote, and it passed by a vote of 42-8 in the Senate. Joining us in working on the bill was the Republican Secretary of State, Brad Johnson, and the current President of the Montana Senate, Senator Essman, and it also had the vote of Representatives Alan Olson and Debbie Barrett. Both of them are Republicans. As soon as that was passed, it became a bone of controversy in the state, and now there was passed by the legislature. And thankfully vetoed, but a bill to eliminate same-day voter registration. And what I think was interesting in the 2013 Montana legislature is that a number of the people who thought it was a good idea back in 2005 now thought it was a bad idea, including Senator Olson, Senator Barrett, and I'm sure Senator Essman as well, the president. And so you may ask, well, what's happened in this last 9 years? I've got an opinion on that, and I'll express it if somebody wants me to talk about it.
Do you want to do it now? Or do you want
No. Do you want to do it now?
Okay. All right. So next we're going to Nancy Lightford, who's going to report for us on the study which the Montana League of Women Voters did on this referendum.
And I think I'd like to start just by, since it's very short, I thought I'd just start by reading to you the cover page. I'm back on. I'm going to start by reading to you the ballot language that you're going to be seeing. It's not that long, so let's just take a moment here and we'll just run through it. Legislative Referendum Number 126, an act referred by the legislature. An act protecting the integrity of Montana elections by ending late voter registration on the Friday before Election Day and eliminating Election Day registration. Ensuring compliance with the National Voter Registration Act. Providing that the proposed act be submitted to the qualified electors of Montana at the general election to be held in November 2014, amending the various sections that need to be amended. The 2013 legislature submitted this proposal for a vote. LR 126 changes the deadline for late voter registration from the close of polls on Election Day to 5 p.m. on the Friday before the election. LR 126 also moves the deadline for changes to an elector's voter registration information from the close of polls on Election Day to 5 p.m. on the Friday before the election. The National Voter Registration Act, referenced in the title of LR 126, does not require elimination of Election Day registration and does not require moving the deadline for changes to an elector's voter registration information. So, I'd like at this point just briefly to ask Professor Johnstone to comment on the relationship between this and the National Voter Registration Act, which is referenced.
Thank you, Nancy. So there is a little confusion arising from the legislature's title for the bill. National Voter Registration Act is called the Motor Voter Law, or a law Congress passed requiring that if, unless you had same-day registration, a state would have to provide a form for voter registration with driver's license applications or other applications. That was the requirement. And so before Montana had same-day registration, it also had, when you filled out your driver's license application, you could also register to vote that way. Montana then adopted same-day registration. Still had the form that you could fill out when you registered for a driver's license, I think. But when they wrote this, a concern arose that if they got rid of same-day registration, they would no longer meet the exception to motor voter, the exception that said you don't have to provide the form with a driver's license if you have same-day registration. And so someone had raised the point that, well, now that if you don't have same-day registration, motor voter requires you to provide the form. Well, we still provided the form one way or the other, but notwithstanding that, the legislature, in an attempt to clarify that the Supreme Court eventually discovered would actually confuse, said that put in these words, ensuring compliance with the National Voter Registration Act. And by saying that, all they meant was that once they got rid of same-day registration, we would still comply with the motor voter because we still had these forms that we had anyway, and that the law didn't change. The court, in response to a challenge, the Supreme Court said that's misleading. They can't rewrite the title, which is odd. It's another pet peeve of mine that the legislature gets to write these all caps titles that can't be changed if they're misleading. But the court ordered the Attorney General to rewrite the second 50 words second 100 words on the ballot, and that's where it says, trying to clarify that the National Voter Registration Act does not require elimination of Election Day registration and does not require moving the deadline. It just requires a form, which we already had and which this doesn't change one way or the other. So that's the relationship and the confusion there. Nothing about this has anything to do with the motor voter bill, and it is unfortunate that it is put in there as a matter of kind of legislative arcana.
Confusion.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. I'd like to just briefly review for you the research that's been done by the League of Women Voters on this issue of same day, or as also it's called, Election Day registration. Just first, of course, a little bit of background. I'm assuming, and I think I can safely assume with this crowd, that everyone's familiar with the League of Women Voters. Is that the case? Yes. Okay, then I won't go into that. You get to a younger crowd, and it's amazing how many people don't know anything about the League, but I won't go through that at this point. We are, as a League, are strongly on the side of egalitarianism. There has, in our history of this country, been two strains of thought about who should vote. Egalitarianism, which I think is something that we, as a country, profess to believe in, but then there's also the other view, which is that it should be elitism of some sort, that there are certain people who should be able to vote and others who should not. And the League is very strongly on the side of egalitarianism, that everyone who should be able to vote should be able to vote. And of course, some of the things that we do create barriers to people being able to vote, not because we're saying they shouldn't vote, but because the effect of them is to be a barrier. And I think that's the largest reason why the League has come out in favor of election day registration of voters, because it takes care of a number of barriers that could otherwise stand in the way of people being enfranchised to vote. So why do we have election day voter registration? It increases voter participation. There were 3 states that had election day registration starting in the 1970s, and those 3 states that are Maine, Minnesota, and Wisconsin have consistently had much higher rates of participation in their elections, 12% higher than the average of all the other states in the country during the time that they were the only ones doing that. Since 2000, a number of other states have adopted the same legislation, as have we. And all of those states now consistently average a good 10 percentage points higher in participation than those states that don't have it. Here in Montana, our voter participation went up 10% between 2008 and 2012. And we had 100,000 people have used same-day registration in Montana since the law was passed in 2005. So it is a big piece of participation in Montana. One of the arguments for using same-day registration is that it is a good safeguard against bureaucratic errors. Now, Professor Johnson mentioned the fact that we do have the option to register to vote when we go and get our cars licensed. Unfortunately, sometimes there are some hiccups in that system. One of the principal ones being that there is no electronic way to transfer the information from one agency to the other. And so what actually has to happen is that the paper information has to be hand-carried from the motor vehicle office over to wherever the election office is in order for it to be then entered into the system and for it to be processed. And sometimes that doesn't happen in a very efficient fashion. And so one of the best things that the voter registration same-day voter registration does for Montana is it guarantees that folks who think they may have registered by using the motor vehicle option and get to the polls and discover that perhaps they're not, they can go ahead and vote. One of the other things that's been discovered, not here in Montana recently, but in other states where there isn't same-day voter registration, is that provisional ballots were responsible for, of the provisional ballots that were filed in other states, 1/3 of them would not have been provisional if they'd been able to register on the same day. And in fact, in Iowa, they had a 67% decline in provisional ballots when they shifted over to doing same-day registration. That's how much of this confusion can be cleaned up by being able to do that. One of the things that is feared by some folks is that election day voter registration will favor one party over another. And there has been some research done on this question, and the evidence that comes out of Wisconsin and Maine and Massachusetts is that actually who uses same-day registration for the most part are middle-class voters who have moved and just didn't get around to re-registering until the time to vote came around. And so what they found is that it allows for elections to be more volatile, but it really hasn't changed the distribution of Republicans versus Democrats who end up actually voting in elections. Another argument is that it is too burdensome for election officials. There's an interesting quote, again, from the Secretary of State in, I think it is in Maine, who said, "The system, as much as people think it does not belong to political candidates. It does not belong to political parties. It does not belong to election administrators. It belongs to the electorate." And that's what same-day voter registration does. It allows for elections to be in the hands of the electorate. And we have been doing this, as John pointed out, since 2006. Every county has an election office, one office they designate as their election office. And people who are not registered can go to that office and register and vote on the same day. Sometimes those offices are located in places like fairgrounds. Sometimes they're located in the same office where the election office is normally. So that's the way we're doing it in Montana. One of the other interesting concerns about same-day voter registration is the opportunity for fraud. In Montana, we have one online informational listing of all the registered voters in the entire state that is accessible by election officials on election day and in the few days thereafter. And so every ballot that's cast in Montana is checked against that list, and everyone, all the election officials make sure that the election ballots that they have and registered in their area are from people who haven't voted anywhere else. So we do have that check against fraud in place in Montana. So I think that with those things in mind, the most important part about same-day voter registration is that it promotes participation in government. That is something the League has been in favor of ever since its inception. The right of every citizen to vote has been a basic League principle, and the League of Women Voters believes that voting is a fundamental citizen right that must be guaranteed. And among those things that it supports is the ability of Montanans to register and vote on election day. I'd just like to end with a quote from the legal director for the Brennan Center for Justice at the New York University School of Law, because it's a very eloquent statement. "We deserve a democracy in which all voices may speak and be heard as equals, regardless of race, ethnicity, wealth, or gender. Election day registration is an important way to make this vision a reality."
Thanks, Nancy. Have you received some questions? Does anyone have a
No, we
question?
don't have any more. Oops. Does anyone, if you have any more questions?
We want to hear John.
Okay. Raise your hand.
Demand performance here.
There's one over, there's a question over here.
Oh, here's the question over here.
I just wanted to ask, so, the 126, well, 126's word is so weird, but we're voting no if we want same-day registration, right?
Correct.
Okay.
You're voting no if you want to keep same-day registration.
Okay,
Right.
thank you.
Okay, so I think by command performance, John, you're on.
Okay, thanks. Well, some people say I'm too angry to be a really good politician, and this is one of the things that really infuriates me.
Settle down, John.
So, thanks. So, what's changed between 2005 and the present? We're now engaged in scorched earth political campaigns. Hold no prisoners, take no prisoners, do whatever it takes to get elected. And I know that the League is sponsoring this, and it's a nonpartisan event, and I won't claim that Democrats haven't engaged in some scorched earth politics in the past. We have. I've seen it in the legislature. I don't like it. But the other party has determined that they do better off if working mothers don't vote or vote in lower numbers, if low-income Americans don't vote in very high numbers, if minorities don't vote in high numbers, and if students don't vote in high numbers. And they've concluded that if you do away with same-day voter registration and casting your ballot, and if you make it more difficult to register, and if you impose onerous ID requirements on voters, remembering that fully 10% of our population doesn't have a driver's license because they don't drive a car, and if the requirement is that you have a driver's license to establish that you are who you claim you are, the other party has recognized that if they engage in these kinds of voter suppression efforts, that they think that they'll stand a better chance of getting elected. It's as simple as that. And when this act starts off by protecting a claim that it's protecting the integrity of Montana elections, there's nothing that has any integrity with that claim. That's fraud. The instances of voter fraud in Montana recently, not perhaps back in the days of when the Copper Kings were fighting, but recently are virtually non-existent. So any claim that this has to be done, that this is a problem that has to be addressed, voter fraud, and we've got to do this by tightening the ID requirements and by eliminating same-day voter registration, is just a lot of nonsense. And I hope I'm not too angry.
John, you were so mild. You were John. John was we'd practiced together in the Attorney General's office in some very intense litigation. And John was always the guru of kind of mildness and perspective, and so I think you do a pretty good job.
Thanks.
Yeah, I don't think of you as an angry person. Right. As the resident academic, let me complicate this a little bit. I was interested in this basic question of before and after the same-day registration, and Nancy offered some statistics, and I'll be interested to get in those. I looked at it, and it's tricky because you have to control for years where there are on years and off years, as well as off years where there are U.S. Senate races and off years where there are not U.S. Senate races. And looking at those, both as a measure of the voting eligible population and the voting age population, I didn't see the needle move on turnout, and so I'd like to figure out and talk with Nancy more, maybe offline, in terms of what's going on there. The bigger picture is, and again, I'm not completely convinced of this, but just so that you understand kind of the facts on the ground, is there might be a cause and effect problem with looking at civically engaged states like Minnesota and Maine and Massachusetts for their turnouts, that they have higher turnout because they have same-day registration. They might have same-day registration because they're people who believe strongly in the right to vote and open access, and they're already showing up to the polls anyway, and they want to be there. And so we'd want to disentangle those effects too. But mainly, I guess my point is the same point I'd made with the Corrupt Practices Act, is that you want to look at things systematically and understand that each state has kind of its own fabric of civic engagement, as well as laws. And so, for example, I suspect that our no excuse absentee voting probably is resulted in maybe a bigger boost in turnout. Polling hours, registration laws, primaries, the primary structure, and whether they're open or closed. And of course, voter ID, all are other things that play into the ultimate turnout. And voter ID, one of the interesting things about it is voter ID, it might depress turnout theoretically by 1 or 2 percentage points in the states that have it, but then again, it might boost it because voter ID is a very mobilizing factor for exactly the populations that John talks about. And so when you pile it all together in people's sense of civic duties, there are all sorts of reasons that people do or don't vote. Voting is irrational because you have a better chance of getting struck by lightning than deciding a statewide election. But so people do it for all sorts of reasons, and lowering the cost of voting is very important in terms of maximizing it. But there are all sorts of things that push the needle. This is a piece of it, but it's worth, again, understanding that there's a pretty big picture there, and there are lots of steps we've already taken or other steps we might take to make it easier for people to vote, that the League is always on the vanguard of, fortunately. And it can be hard to disentangle the effect of just one voting law change from the whole picture.
Thank you.
Don't mind moving this on.
No, we don't.
All right, well, I think that's the end of our program as far as focusing up here. But I want to thank everybody who's here. First of all, our speakers, Nancy and John and Anthony, and also John Model for having given us their time and their expertise this evening. I want to thank all of you for being here and staying a little bit later maybe than you thought. Somebody once said, democracy will never catch on. It takes up too many Thursday nights. So I mean, given us your Thursday night, but I think that we really all have learned a lot. I certainly have this evening, and it's good to know that there are folks around who are really intent on our system belonging to us, the electorate. So now let's give a hand to the rest of our speakers. And amble around, talk to your candidates, talk to your constituents' candidates, talk to your neighbors, and keep informed. Thank you, everybody.